let's
All
hope they
right,
have a good
let's watch this
interview.
interview.
Hi Ian, how you doing?
Hey, pretty good. Always good to be here, Mike. Looking forward to another fun conversation.
I'm so happy you called me Mike. Like, it's very awkward when people call me Preach. It's very, very awkward.
Right.
Wait a second. He said it's very awkward when people call him Preach. Dude, I only refer to him as Preach.
Superb. Okay,
Exactly
this
what
is
you'd
the
expect.
biggest sore spot, I think, from the raiders in the community is Conduit Energy. I mean, do I need to say anything?
Not even just raiders, everybody. Mythic Plusers. I don't know if PvPers ever have to like swap between multi-role, but this is, I mean, we brought this up yesterday, so just to give you my full viewpoint on it, I've thought about this a lot, because I think there's like some redeemable things with Covenants in some ways, even though I still feel like that could be better. But Conduit Energy is something in the game that I feel like has absolutely no use, and it's just Blizzard choosing to die on the hill of it still needing to exist as a system, even though it's been heavily nerfed since its original inception. It was way more restrictive if you guys weren't around during beta. But then I feel like when they made it less restrictive, it became the biggest what is the point thing of all time. Like, what is the fucking point of Conduit Energy? There is none. So I'm hoping to hear something good here.
I mean, everyone loves it. That's the feedback we've heard. So we just figure we'll proceed as we are. Yeah, I mean, and the feedback is we've heard is not just from raiders, also from I've heard this from hardcore arena folks.
Yeah, of course.
But particularly people who are active players, playing in multiple types of content.
Mhm.
And I think our take on Conduit Energy right now is that it's imperfect for sure.
Okay.
Part of the goal of the system as a whole is to situate your soulbind layout, your conduit placement across all of your soulbinds as a bit more of a semi-rigid choice when it comes to friction.
Oh
You
my
have things that you
God.
can swap back and forth all
Oh
the
my
time,
fucking
like
God.
your talents or your spec, and you have things that
Oh
are
no.
immutable like your
All
class.
right.
These are somewhere in the middle. The thing we wanted to avoid was yet another system where the routine behavior for most players is as you're doing your farm clear of the raid, you're switching to AoE conduits for Council of Blood, then hearthing, swapping to single target for Sludge Fist, then back to AoE cleave setup for generals, and so forth. And that just becomes an extra layer of, frankly, inconvenience, nuisance, and undermines elements of choice inherent in the system.
Okay, so he's saying that he wants Conduit Energy to still exist because if you're a DPS player, we don't want it to be something where you have to hearth and change your conduits on a like boss by boss basis, which is actually like kind of right. Like that would be weird. Imagine if like you're running your raids and suddenly everyone is zoning out like every other boss to optimize a conduit. Even though that's how most classes don't react that way. Most classes have like with two potencies right now, like you don't really have a lot of like most classes don't have that many good conduits. So like if they made better conduits though, and you could swap it freely, specifically on a spec to spec basis, that would be very annoying. However, the main people who Conduit Energy affects are people who play multiple specs of the same class, and they're frequently put in a position where they can't play the game as much as they want because they just have to run a noticeably suboptimal build of the off spec just to not run out of Conduit Energy. That is the thing they need to fix. But at least he kind of alluded to them wanting to fix that problem but not enable the other one. So it's not as bad as a thing as I thought. The way he started that was, in my opinion, not the best way to do it, but I think what he actually ended up saying made sense. He wants it to be more alt friendly, but he doesn't want it to be a point where it's gone and then people are just spam changing conduits in the middle of content all the time. Because I think that is true. Like, do you guys think that? I mean, obviously, if you had to choose one or the other, you would choose for there to be no Conduit Energy. But I think it's actually possible that if it's done right, like if it's done right, that having it there could be a beneficial thing. But I just think it's so unlikely. We'll get into some other things they keep saying. Spec-based Conduit Energy, but also essences existed. Yeah.
And this is an area where feedback can help us a lot, is to focus on the soulbinds, the specific soulbinds that may feel mandatory for specific specs. As we're expanding.
Dude, okay, the mandatory thing is I feel like something they don't get about gaming nowadays. No one's out here trying to play their off spec with a suboptimal soulbind because they don't want, like, it is mandatory almost. Like, If there's a de facto best soulbind, that's what you want to be playing. Ever gatekeeping what people want to be playing is a problem. That's like an old school WoW mentality. Like, you have to make a choice and it fucking matters and there's no going back and all this stuff. But like, really, in 2021, people just want to game on classes they enjoy and they want to be optimal. And it just feels worse to game on something when you're suboptimal in any way.
The soulbind system as a whole, adding new rows, adding new traits, gives us a chance to balance the system better without nerfing the ones that are currently good, but giving compelling reasons to use the others.
Yeah, not to mention that some of the conduits and some of the soulbinds are broken as fuck,
resto,
right?
This other one for balance. You're fine. You can just switch
like
back
most
and forth.
most of the game that are playing certain covenants are all playing one soulbind because the soulbinds are so overpowered. You know,
field, it all works. It's when you feel like everything has to go through one specific one that the system does kind of break down. We want to see what we can do over the course of this PTR cycle to improve that situation, though other options like increasing the recharge rate of Conduit Energy are also on the table.
I'm not gonna lie, I liked his answer a lot more than I was expecting, because I came into that question being ready to fucking cage match anyone that was going to defend Conduit Energy for any reason, and I'm still pretty much there, and I still kind of agree with it seems like a system that doesn't need to be there, because the only scenario where it's still existing and it being better than having no energy is if it prevents degenerate. Like, I'm telling you right now, it would be miserable if the meta was, I'm not saying it would be this, is if people swap literally Hearth to their Covenant Hall at the end of every boss to change shit. That would be so, I would hate that. Oh my God, that would be terrible. But obviously the not being able to play your off specs is worse. They could let you switch with a tome. That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Just like talents. I think they fundamentally disagree with that, though. As much as we obviously think differently, they don't want everything to just be pop a tome, change your Covenant, conduit, and all that stuff, right? They want that stuff to matter. And regardless, like they're obviously like they're on that hill, right? Like they're not coming off that hill this expansion, so like it's almost not even worth talking about. Yeah, points. The best thing I've seen so far is points per spec makes more sense. Right, or just conduits per spec. Like if you are a Windwalker and you swap to Mistweaver, like your conduits just fucking instantly change. So it's just on a yeah, I don't know.
Seeing on the player. I want to move on to some nerdy questions now, but it's become more widespread, of course, with the MDI being available and all the things people are seeing there.
Okay.
Congratulations to Echo, by the way.
Oh, that's why I paused it. Yeah.
Healer DPS, because this has been going on for a few years.
Oh
now,
yeah.
Is the discrepancy has become so large. That genuinely, if you bring
Holy
those
Paladins
high
are
DPS
fine.
healers, your raid is just so significantly easier because it's like you're bringing extra DPS characters as well. It's like you're playing with more than 20 men, you know? What is the situation internally with that? In terms of, I mean, more to the point, there's some, I know several people who've quit because they're like Resto Druids because they're just not able, they just feel like a waste of time compared to these other characters.
Correct.
Yeah, this is definitely something that we're
literally had one of the best players to ever be in this guild. Refute was a one-trick Resto Druid. That guy was incredibly good at the game, and Resto Druid just wasn't meta for 2 years, and he quit.
Discussing solutions can be easier said than done without gutting specs or existing playstyles in the middle of a tier or the middle of an expansion. But I think both Holy Paladin and Disc Priest are obviously discussed a lot, and the big factor is healer. It's not just healer DPS; it's free healer DPS. Effectively, I think being able to trade off between damage done and throughput is interesting. We obviously want people to be able to solo as healers, do things like Torghast as healers if they want, and in situations where there isn't significant HPS needed, doing damage is a way that you contribute, and that's a mark of a skilled player. I think the tricky part is when your optimal healing throughput also gives you a bunch of damage. Disc was designed around that. And the trick there on our end is, and we've been more or less successful at this at times, often less successful, dialing in disk throughput so that they are useful, often invaluable, but not all around the best without weaknesses. When they are topping healing meters and also contributing the damage they do, that's a big problem.
Correct.
Things like reining in Spirit Shell and
well, before Spirit Shell, like just even in the last expansion, 2 expansions, it was when they I think it was WoD, where they said they wanted Disc Priest to be, we want this to be like a niche spec. It's going to be, 80% of a healer, but it's going to be like 30% of a DPS. So it's like overall it's 110% like value basically if you consider like you're bringing one role to be, you know, potentially a little bit of both. But the problem they got wrong is they gave them the damage aspect, but their healing has just always been great. So it's just been too good for too long. And then now Holy Pallies in this expansion are basically, at least damage wise, better than Disc Priests ever were. Maybe more damage than any healer has ever done in the history of this game, relative to other healers and relative to DPS in the right scenario.
And the rest of their kit is trying to move a little bit in that direction, both in 905 and 91, where a Holy Priest should give more overall throughput consistently. But when you bring a Disc Priest, well, their absorbs can be like truly irreplaceable if they let you survive mechanics that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. And then, of course, their damage is their damage.
Since the nerf,
while still giving them enough throughput to be able to manage a dungeon or
No.
other content if they need to. Holy Paladin is a bit of a different case, where I think they are a larger problem. Some of that is
true.
You know, some of it's Ashen Verdict stuff, but I think it's also that one of many
Ashen's Verdict? Did he mean to say Ashen Hollow?
a playstyle that is one of many has become kind
Oh,
of
he
the
just meant
default
Hollow.
and the
Okay.
highest throughput playstyle. Having the option to spend the fight in melee range, spending a third of your GCDs on like Crusader Strike and Judgment, that should be an option for a Holy Paladin. But the fact that it's the best way to play a Holy Paladin, I think is not ideal. And if you had to trade off
Yeah.
healing throughput to do that damage, that would be a better space for this.
So basically they have to decide. Right now, Disc Priests, Mistweavers to a lesser degree, and Holy Paladins do damage while healing, while the other healers can do damage, but they have to choose between healing and damage. Usually when they do balancing or they do any kind of things like that, they usually do the thing that requires the least amount of work. For example, everyone hates nerfs. They're like, if something's really insane, then just buff other things to be the same as it. Well, that doesn't always make sense. If there's 30 DPS specs and 2 of them are overpowered, it's obviously infinitely easier to just nerf the 2 outliers than it would be to buff 28 other things, right? So you can even scale that down and it still makes sense. The things that don't make sense right now is there's like half the healers that don't and half that do. Obviously, Holy Paladin is way too overtuned for damage, but like if you removed the ability for Paladins to do damage while healing to make it the same as the other ones, that would be really weird. But it would also be a lot more work to allow every healer to do damage while healing. But I feel like that's probably the better thing. Also, because Paladins and Mistweavers are technically melee, they're absolutely melee characters. I feel like they should do more damage than the other healers. Those two specifically, obviously not to the level that Paladins do now. But I really do feel that way because being in melee is certainly in the way the game is designed, is in a lot of ways can hinder you. You should be rewarded for doing that. But I think they need to increase monk damage and then nerf paladin damage. Disc damage is okay. If you include power infusion, it's behind paladin, but it's not by as much as you think.
As a whole.
Okay. Another big concern that I had
Good question.
From the Raider friends was obviously the effect of raid cooldowns, individual buffs.
Oh, shit, here we
this
go.
Covers a lot of
All right.
ground, Ian. This was from PI and certainly Anti-Magic Zone.
Here
Especially
we
from
go.
the melee friends out there who look at the very limited raid spots they get amongst all those specs. Yet, when something like AMZ is just as good as it is, 2 of those are taken instantly by DKs because they're just making the fight
Or
so
more.
much easier.
2 is a
And I
conservative
know there's been
argument.
some back and forth in previous interviews about we don't want to just give everybody a raid buff. We don't just want to do X and Y, but it's certainly causing
Okay, so I haven't done anything yet.
frustration, I think is the word we're looking for. I'm wondering what your internal thinking on this is.
AMZ is too good. That's,
Oh no, sorry, Death Knights.
Okay, before he mentions where he thinks he got this information, and regardless of whatever I said, AMZ is too good. It is. You don't that I didn't do that. I didn't make AMZ too good. It's too good. Like I've been suggesting nerfs for a while. I mean, let's hear the rest of it.
I'm so sorry.
I mean, you convinced me. I thought it was fine, but then you stated the case so
AMC, you
eloquently.
said, Mike, was it?
And okay, problem solved. Nerf AMZ. I mean, I was. This is something we talk about a bunch. I think I was watching. I think Max had a video recently on raid comps and.
Yo. He didn't call me what new viewers call me. You guys know when people come into the chat and they're like, hey, Limit, what's going to be the best thing for next tier? And I'm like, I'm not the guild. You know what I mean? But he called me Max like he knows me on a fucking first name basis. He's like, yo, Max, what's up? That's what he just did. He didn't say maximum. He just said my fucking name. Clout received. 1 second. Gotta change my stream title. All right.
Melee slots.
Onwards?
And, he was also making the point of, like, yeah, that there's this finite number of melee slots.
Wait, what
which
is
separately we would like to increase.
What is Preach doing? Wait, Preach, back up. Why are you hiding? Why is he fucking hiding? Where are you going, Preach?
Number of melee slots, which separately we would like to increase, but that's more of an encounter design question.
Okay, so that's good. So that means that, well, I mean, I wasn't the person who realized that obviously melee are not as valuable in raids because of a lot of design decisions they make in raids specifically, not power level. I think the take that ranged are always better than melee and power level. I can't speak on PvP, but in both Mythic Plus and in raiding over time has not been true. There have been multiple raids where melee are like the best classes in the game. In fact, I'd say it's like pretty even. It's just I can actually go into my thought process more on that in a second, but it's not because of that. It's just like because of the way raids are, kind of.
And you're currently allocating half of them to DKs. Having a tool like AMZ is awesome. Having tools like Darkness and other things are awesome. I think AMZ is just
right.
Something like that potentially, yes. And rogues, I think are lacking actually in raid utility. And rogues can definitely use something there. I think rogues have it covered in dungeons, but when it comes down to, currently looking at your raid comp, there aren't enough reasons to say, oh no, we can't sit the rogue because blank. Like, what is that blank? There needs to be something. With AMZ, it's just a question of magnitude. Honestly, in most situations, arguably, like AMZ is perhaps better than a major cooldown like Power Word Barrier, right? Most damage is magical.
It literally
so 20% DR on a 2-minute cooldown versus 25% on a 3-minute cooldown.
Yeah, it's
probably
objectively
take the former
better
in a lot of cases.
Yes.
And you can stack them easily. That's not great, right? One of the things we're discussing, we want to make some changes here. One of the things we're discussing is actually bringing back, like AMZ long time ago used to have a total absorption cap.
No.
Kind of like a stronger.
No, do not do that. That was fucking bad. It makes it awful because basically when you do an absorption cap, at least the way they used to scale it is they scaled it to like not even absorb like a whole ability or even close to it. And it instantly gets absorbed by any raid damage. And it seemed like it was tuned for something that should have hit 5 people and not 20. That is, no, do not make that change. If Ian's listening to the playlist, the best way to nerf AMZ would not be to reduce its efficacy either. It would be reducing the cooldown. Make it a 4-minute cooldown. Make it a 5-minute cooldown. Then you'll stop stacking DKs, but they'll still have it be worth to them in raid. The worst thing you could do is to make AMZ worthless. AMZ is fine if it's just reduced in power level. Just increase the cooldown and still have it be 20%. But like just in something like P1 Denathrius, like DKs were able to AMZ the pull and AMZ the end of the phase. Like it's just the cooldown is the problem. The cooldown is the problem. Or did I say reduce? Increase the thing. Okay, you guys can complain all you want about him mentioning it. Like, first of all, I don't give a shit. Pointing out that AMZ is overpowered that's obvious. For the rest of the expansion going forward, if they don't nerf AMZ, you would have had at minimum, again, this is world first race. If you're doing other shit, there's a lot of other options you have. But like world first race, you are going to see every top team running at minimum 2 Death Knights for the rest of the expansion, probably 3. In this raid, there was 4. Probably wouldn't be 4 going forward. That's a bit of overkill. But 3 classes. Imagine we already think raid buffs are a problem, where it's like, oh, well, 6 of the characters in the raid, paladins, priests, onwards and onwards, right? Warrior, mage, monk, DH, and warlock, obviously paladin, all that shit. There's like a certain amount of raid spots that are just designated to certain classes because of raid buffs. And then the rest of the raid, you have to pick between certain things. Well, with the limited amount of melee spots, you're just only going to see buff classes and DKs. And the likelihood that another class is good enough on a tier-by-tier basis is low, but possible. But you're just alienating so many players. So that had to be addressed. In fact, I cannot remember an expansion where, again, you guys are going to point out raids where you guys brought 3 or 4 mages for multiple raids. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying when you are someone like me or a lot of other people where they go into a raid preparing certain classes, there has never been a time where every single raid for an expansion, you would say, oh, well, we have to run 3 of this class. Check that and then move on. That has never happened. People will mention that Like, oh, will you likely run a lot of these classes? Yes, but that's usually tuning based. Yes, they're very strong, mages, warlocks, all that shit. But it's not every raid. In fact, it usually switches between like mages, hunters, sometimes moonkins. But that's never been like that. And when there's already less melee spots in general, it just, the DKs having AMZ in its current form is a major problem. It's just a fact. That being said, DKs will probably be mad at that, but I am not the reason your ability is clearly overpowered.
Version of Earth and Wall Totem. I think there's probably some version where it's still good. It's effectively not nerfed at all for dungeon use, or
So yeah, I guess my exact response to this before he finishes this, and I'll rewind it in a second, is yes, nerf AMZ, but please, 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 please do not make it an absorb for a certain amount of damage like it used to be. That would be horrific, a horribly bad
dropping
change.
it, kind of like a stronger version of Earth and Wall Totem. I think there's probably some version where it's still good. It's effectively not nerfed at all for dungeon use, or you're dropping it on a flag in a battleground or whatever. But you're not getting quite the effectiveness that you are using it on Denathrius or Council in a 20+ raid group. And we want it to be useful, but not quite the just amazing all-purpose solution that it is now.
Like, there's already melee classes with raid cooldowns. Like, again, Rally and AMZ are completely different in the way that they are used, right? Rally works against physical threats. It also is technically worthless unless someone were to die when you use it, and obviously AMZ actually reduces damage. But there's already melee classes in the game that bring raid cooldowns for your whole group that are at least somewhat comparable. They're just obviously on a longer cooldown. The main issue with AMZ is that it's on a really short cooldown. That's the main one.
But a lot of this just comes down to how many slots are seen as viable for melee in raids. I think it was interesting. It's an interesting discussion. Getting back to that Max video I mentioned earlier.
Again! Let's go.
He kind of took it as a given that, yeah, there's like 5 melee spots.
I did not take it as a given. That was actually based on the average amount of melee DPS specs since Warlords of Draenor. The number is 5. That's the number. It's not me saying going forward that's what you're going to run. In fact, we actually used more melee in this raid. That was a historical take.
Right, you have 14 DPS, you basically have 5 melee and 9 ranged. And then within that, this is the calculus. Like, we need to raise that number. And one of the questions that we're asking ourselves in discussion among, the combat team and the encounter team is, how can we make it the right answer to bring 7, ideally 8 melee? Right, if you have 14 DPS, bring 7 of each. Right, why isn't that the starting point, and then you tweak it one way or the other? And in that world, it'd be much easier to justify a much more diverse raid composition. Right, I think that currently it feels like, oh, you can't possibly justify more than 1 rogue, but meanwhile you have 3 mages over there, or 3 warlocks, or 3 hunters, and you don't think anything of it. And so that's the angle we're trying to tackle this from.
Okay, so I'm really glad he brought that up. So first of all, something that he's not considering is the fact that multiple healers right now are melee as well. So if you want every raid to be 7 melee, 7 ranged, ideally, with 2 healers, that's 9 melee. The only boss in history that had the top 5 guilds on average run 8 to 10 melee was Gul'dan. And that was for one specific reason. Melee basically did nothing on the fight. They just hit the boss, while the 4 ranged, or I think it was 6, including healers, total classes that could be picked by the eyeball were easy to spread out. If you had a ton of ranged on that fight and you didn't know who it was going on, you could actually cleave a bunch of damage on people. But since there were so few range, the entire raid was stacked and a couple of people were outside, it was very, very easy to deal with that mechanic. And then the last phase didn't punish melee at all. So yeah, I know he said 7 DPS range in melee. So that would even be more melee centric. But I think it's important nowadays, especially because the only time you ever worry about running too many melee is when you're worried about specifically like having too many people in melee slots, right? Like, let's look at history. So I will show you the spreadsheet that he's talking about. Right, and I'll show you some things in history, and also a YouTube comment I made to someone who was confused about the exact video he's referring to, and it'll kind of give you an idea of why things like that. They ask why things are like that. The title of the video is "Why Melee Classes Aren't Brought to Raids." A bunch of people were really confused in the comments, and they were saying, "Why, Max? I don't get it. Why? You kept using this this example where you had 5 melee and the rest of range, but you never talked about why that is." Well, very simply, Just to read my own comment, this is the historical average of optimal usage. It would be an entirely other video to discuss why this has become the case. A few points, though, since I will likely not do that. You frequently get punished for stacking too many melee. This is not ever true for range. That except for that one Gul'dan scenario. If you ran too many range, you actually did get punished. You had more cleaving going on than the amount of actual melee. There's so many more raid mechanics that are harder for melee that this is just the way that the thinking has been for a long time. And it doesn't even have to be every boss. There's only been one raid in my knowledge, or I guess that I can think of right now, that was horrific for melee the entire time, right? So if you go to Uldir Fetid Devour, okay, and you just look up some YouTube video, normal and heroic, whatever, on mute. So this boss, when you guys had melee the entire time on Mythic, you could not stack with each other, right? This is from the raid Uldir. If you were next to someone else when new circles were going out, you would instantly spread to them. You could basically run at most 6 melee. If you looked at a fight like Vectis in Uldir, it's the same thing. The exact same kind of thing, where there was like a spread mechanic once you had a certain amount of stacks that you had to like be away from other people. So the amount of melee you had just greatly increased, the lethality of that mechanic. Where the amount of mechanics that exist for that in ranged are like, I'm not kidding, it's like one in every like 2 or 3 raids where there's one thing that makes you think the way that melee think on like a lot of raid encounters. You guys remember pre-nerf Mithrax? Okay, you guys remember this? Before they nerfed this, anytime these circles went out, which was every 15 seconds, if your melee were stacked, you would just all get MC'd and basically wipe, and it did raid damage, right? So running, even though it was a giant boss model, running more melee was bad. It just hurt you more than range would ever hurt you. So like that's the reason why melee aren't really broad. It's not a power thing. I think I even said it here. A bad take would be that ranged are always designed better. In fact, I would argue over the course of the game that they have been very evenly balanced in terms of output. There are just, for the amount of raids there are, where like Warlocks are the clear best class, Mages are the clear best class, there's plenty of raids where Arms Warrior destroyed. Windwalker was the best class in the tier. Frosty K in the past has been the best class for a tier. Like, if you're talking about like the best class, at least specifically in raiding, I don't care about PvP, melee are very strong. Also, the take that ranged are super good in Mythic Plus. Right now, you have 2 melee, 2 ranged. Holy Paladin, usually a Rogue or Windwalker, and then you have, at least on live, a Moonkin and a Mage, and then a tank, right? It's 2 and 2. If you want to speak specifically DPS, it's 1 to 2. For the last couple expansions, multiple metas have been like Windwalker Rogue X, or DH X, or triple Windwalker, or triple Rogue. Like, melee has dominated PvE Mythic Plus for the history of Mythic Plus, where now, basically just because of the restrictive for no reason AoE cap, you see more ranged in keys, not to mention because of storming and stuff like that. But here's the thing, Mythic Plus is done in a way where if there's really bad mods, you just don't push that week. So it doesn't really matter about melee Mythic Plus if there's bad melee mechanics, because you'll just push on a week where there's no melee mechanics and then just not play the game on ones where there are. So, it's not as restrictive as you'd think, at least in the way that it's usually done. So again, at the end, was a fair criticism would be Blizzard doesn't do enough to make a melee always worth it, but in my opinion, this would leave them very limited in the amount of mechanics they can make. This is what kind of my point. If you guys are looking at these bosses, that they are limited. And I'll tell you this, if Blizzard goes out of their way to make melee, be way less restrictive in raid content, I think they're actually treading a really dangerous line, because if you think about fights where, and I'll use Gul'dan as another example, the reason why melee were stacked on that fight and you ran more melee than ranged was because it was absurdly broken. Like, those classes did nothing. Raid content would just become easier. You would need like 4 or 5 range to do basically any mechanics, and your melee would do nothing. Because in reality, if your melee are still doing really hard mechanics, then running melee is generally bad, because there's a ton of movement, or you have to move out for stuff, or anything. All that stuff affects range more than melee. If you have to run away from the boss with a living bomb that's going to spread to everyone else, you are losing damage where range lose less of that damage. If you are, running something across the room or getting rid of a debuff or something, like, you lose damage, they don't. If you have to, any spread mechanic that's ever existed immediately screws melee. But are they just never going to make spread mechanics again? There's plenty of fights where spread mechanics were unironically hard and they were fine, and you still ran a lot of melee. Outside of like a few fights in Uldir, we ran 6 melee for almost that whole raid. That's a lot. That's like a lot of melee. And this was like the most melee punishing raid of all time. So I think I like to hear that they want to incorporate more melee, because at the very end of the day, when you look at the spreadsheet that I was using, another problem that I pointed out, okay, I don't have the actual color for it, but I'm just going to put Windwalker right here. Right now, also, with the amount of few melee spots you have, it's not even just a DK problem. It's a buff problem, right? It's like, so yeah, you could bring a couple buffs from tanks, but who knows? Some of the non-buff tanks do way more damage than the other tanks. So if you're talking about overall raid DPS, as long as DH and Fury Warrior are tuned really well, maybe Windwalker, I'll just use 2 for this example, you know, you have very few melee spots left and you just have a ton of melee specs. AMZ is a problem, but you know what's just as big of a problem? DH is bringing a raid buff. Why? Like, you know, the exact comment I think he made the other day. Okay, so this was, here we go. This was in the Chinese interview. The Chinese community did an interview with Ian that was translated and it was posted the other day. And this was an exact question. And the exact this, there's spells before a boss fight, such as Horn of Winter, cast by Death Knights, Gift of the Wild for Druids. He says, we're currently not planning on giving everybody a buff. I'm glad they're doing that, because giving everybody a buff would be terrible. The better solution is no one having buffs, but I understand they're going to be somewhere in there. But here's the issue with that. One of the challenges is we want all classes to feel a bit different from each other, blah, blah, blah. When everyone has something, it's cool to be a part of the ceremony of seeing all the buffs go out, but whatever. This thing that I highlighted. So we want every class to have some unique benefits and reasons why people in your group or raid are happy to see you there. That's the goal. That's not true at all. Imagine saying this to a holy priest, a Resto Druid, or a raiding Mistweaver for the past 3 years. You just haven't done that. It's not true. This isn't the case. If you're going to do the some classes have raid buffs and some don't thing, other classes need something to make them unique, and they don't. They're not all the same. You can't list, you know, DHs having, you know, a 5% magic damage buff, a warrior having a, you know, attack power buff, a Windwalker having this buff, and then you're like, oh, well, Enhance has Wind Fury, not the same, you know. Hunter has what exactly? Ret has some good raid utility, sure, it's clearly a tier below. They're not the same. Some things are just too powerful. Scrolls were gotten rid of for who knows what reason. You know, it's just more restrictive. And then on top of all of that, there's the AoE cap, where, among other things, it's just another line of weird, somehow your class, I guess, just didn't get AoE capped because what exact reason? And then I'm capped at 5 targets forever, yet there are multiple scenarios in PvE specifically where you get to AoE cap. It's all just so weirdly, pointlessly, in my opinion, restrictive. And I think the game was at a much better balance point when there were not raid buffs that were basically required. That's basically my whole bit. But yeah, I mean, but people are complaining about DK though, probably because DKs were run for the last raid, 4 of them. But let's just say, so this is how many melee we ran last raid, okay? Including 2 Holy Paladins as well that aren't being listed here. You guys are, it's still, the problem with my video that I pointed out was that the reason why these classes aren't brought usually is because there's, you know, so many specs to go for so few spots. That's still likely going to continue. It's just not going to be DKs. For example, if I prepare correctly for an end boss and I'm going to bring 6 melee, I'm not going to bring, you know, I'm just using random classes as an example. This is not going to be my raid comp. It could be, but here's why it won't. You're going to bring the 2 you need for a raid buff specifically, and then you're going to bring this 4 times. If I bring multiple classes that aren't the literal best, then I prepared wrong. This isn't Pokemon. You're not trying to collect them all. You don't need like a raid comp with every single class in it. I just want the best one, right? So now that's very unique to the World First race, and this is a much broader problem. I think the reality is if your guild... Oh, is the cam blocking it? Okay, well, you get my point, right? If I can just do it here. The goal is, if you're going to bring more melee to a raid in general, that's great. I just think there's a lot of logistical problems with that, because I think Blizzard makes really good raids, and naturally mechanics that seem harder for melee are usually not as bad as people think, but it's usually one boss. Like if I'm making, I even mentioned this in my comment, when developing raid comps, you often want one that works for all bosses. Often melee are great at most, but bad at least one. All it takes is one fight to look terrible for melee to immediately turn off a raid leader from running 7 melee for the entire raid. That's the issue. But then if you start making entire raids where there's no melee mechanics, then melee just becomes by default an easier role than ranged. And then that doesn't really solve the problem. It just puts it somewhere else. Right now, there's no there's not like fights aren't necessarily easy for ranged or melee or healers or tanks. There's plenty of fights where I could point out that a certain role is harder than others because of a certain reason. It's not a default thing that's true amongst all of the fights. I feel like my only worry is that melee becomes the role that your ranged players do all the mechanics and your melee just get to just slam the boss. And it just, I don't know, it could kind of take away parts of the game from that. But I think the overall reality is if you could copy and paste any 4 classes here, right after your 2 buffs that you're bringing, your guild would want to feel good about that. And just as Ian posted, you would want to have reasons why people in your group or raid are happy to see you there. That needs to be fixed with these classes. There just needs to be more with them. Nerfing AMZ is fine and it needs to happen. Hopefully they do it the right way and they don't do the absorb cap thing. But it's just a much more nuanced problem than just DKs, because I think a lot of the outrage is just, well, last raid looked like this. Well, that's fine. But based on tuning, maybe next raid like looks like this or something, right? Like, who knows? Okay, so Preach. So sad Maximum killed AMZ and melee spots. So, okay.